The book is about the extent to which American corporations own Britain. They've taken over a lot of companies and they've been successful in expanding their businesses into the UK. And the result of that is really very bad for ordinary British people.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, I talk with economist and entrepreneur Angus Hanton about American corporations buying up Britain.
They're not doing that for fun. They're doing that for profits, and they will be getting that money back by sucking money out of the British economy. Ever since Margaret Thatcher's time, the British have said we're open for business, and by open for business, essentially we mean we're for sale.
Angus talks about the impact of this takeover and what Britain can do to recover.
We need to start by saying we want to be independent. We need to organise our tax system, which is broken in so many ways, that people are incentivised to build businesses that stay British.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with entrepreneur and investor Angus Hanton. Angus, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So your book, Vassal State, How America Runs Britain, is out. It's an excellent read. Can you start by giving us an overview of what the book is about?
The book is about the extent to which American corporations own Britain. They've taken over a lot of companies and they've been successful in expanding their businesses into the UK. And the result of that is really very bad for ordinary British people. And it's not just economics, it's not just corporate takeovers, it's also the politics that it's led to American domination of British political thinking.
So we're all very proud in Britain of our corporations, finance sector, but I mean, how much of UK business is actually owned by American interests at this point, and how does it compare with other nations?
It's much more owned by American companies than other economies, even than Canada or Mexico, which you would expect to be very US dominated. In terms of the numbers, US turnover in the UK is about $800 billion a year in an economy that is only about just over 3 times that in size. So it's you could think of it as being a third of the economy.
Right.
But actually in some ways it's more than that because some of that economy is the state. So it's huge, but it's not just the size of it, it's also the type. The Americans have been very successful in owning what I think of as the pipes and the bridges of the economy. The bridges over which everyone must cross and over which the owner of the bridge can charge a toll and has a certain monopoly power, and the pipes through which everything runs, and whoever owns the pipes can charge people to go through that. So for example, if you want to sell something second hand, you'll usually use eBay. So you're a British person selling something to another British person, but there'll be a toll charged in the process by an American corporation. The same even if you buy stuff from Amazon, very often it's not stored in Amazon warehouses, it's British companies selling to you, but they're using the Amazon platform effectively to sell through. If you book a hotel or Airbnb, for example, a bed and breakfast, you'll do it through Airbnb, so a toll goes to California. If you use software, we all do, that's almost all American controlled. So it's a huge number of transactions are paying a price to do the transaction. Of course, when you pay, you'll be usually paying through Visa or MasterCard or Amex or Apple Pay or PayPal. All those 5 are US companies. There's a very small number of payments that aren't. So as we've gone from cash to cashless, we've gone from UK controlled and no royalty to an economy where everyone's, for almost all transactions, is paying a royalty that adds up for using payment systems.
To American companies?
To American companies, yeah.
Right, and then if I'm out doing my shopping in the high street, in the supermarket, I feel like I'm buying British stuff, but from reading your opening chapter, I'm probably not.
Very often you do it, absolutely. You go into Boots and you think, oh, this is a British company from Nottingham, set up 150 years ago. But then when you look at the small print, you find that it's owned by Walgreens in America, so you're actually trading with an American company. When you buy many of the drugs that or pharmaceuticals that you might buy there, the majority of them will be, particularly the high-value ones, will be from American companies. Though, of course, there are Swiss and British companies supplying as well, but more than you would think are American. And then you might move on from Boots to buy yourself a coffee at Costa, and you think, oh, that's owned by Whitbread, a company that owns hotels as well. But actually, when you look at it, you find that 3 or 4 years ago, it was bought by Coca-Cola. So Costa is effectively you're buying from Coca-Cola. The same, obviously, one knows other stores like Starbucks and McDonald's who might sell you a coffee. You know that they're American companies, but Cafe Nero, you might not realise, it owned by an American. So coffee, and then when you go to many of the stores that you think of as British, they actually have American private equity owners. Because you see, there have been these 3 big prongs of American takeover. There's the multinationals, the conventional ones that we knew about, Mars Corporation, Kellogg's, Procter & Gamble, and the oil companies, Exxon, which is called Esso here. So there are those ones that we've known about for a long time, which have expanded a lot since the financial crash of 2009 or so. But there are 2 other big new prongs, which is the tech companies, the 5 or 6 big tech companies, US-based, who've really expanded their footprint and taken over a lot of aspects of our lives. But then there's also the private equity, which is more sort of behind the scenes. So this is US finance, mostly based in New York, some in Chicago and some on the West Coast as well, and some in Texas. But mostly New York companies like Blackstone, Apollo, who've bought lots of traditional British companies, but kept, as you rightly say, they've kept the badging British. So people still think that when they go to theme parks, that these are British owned, but they're usually owned by American private equity.
You mentioned the big tech companies there. I mean, we all love their products. But can you talk to us a bit more about their influence?
Yeah, well, they've started to penetrate every aspect of our lives, haven't they? Our social life, our trading, our finding things, and they've just filtered into everything that we do, and they've done it in a very profitable way, and they pay very low tax. But my big complaint, which is I've voiced in the book, my big complaint is that the British government have accepted them and welcomed them. And today, actually, the 12th of September is an interesting day because it's the day that Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor, has announced with great pride that she's expanded the British economy by allowing Amazon to spend $12 billion building data centres in the UK. Well, they're not doing that for fun. They're doing that for profits, and they will be getting that money back by sucking money out of the British economy. And it's a very sad thing that Amazon have relied on to do this, because there have been in the past British data companies that were willing to do cloud storage, but the government buying policies meant that those companies went out of business. And Amazon are also not revealing where these are. So Rachel Reeves may say, well, we're creating lots of jobs, but I'm thinking, well, where are those jobs? It may well be they're in areas where we don't actually need new employment. It's everything. When you submit your tax return, you'll almost certainly be doing it on Microsoft software without a choice, without an option. And many government forms, we hear of the expression Acrobat. You send in a form by Acrobat, and everyone just thinks, oh, that's a nice name, that's a nice thing. But it's a US corporation. I think it's owned by Adobe. But in any case, these are almost all that software is US. And when you talk to people face to face, of course, no one charges a fee. But in the real world now, what we do is we mostly talk to people on Facebook, owned by Meta, US corporation, or we talk to people on Twitter, owned by Elon Musk in the US. So in effect, what Musk calls the town square of Twitter is owned by the Americans. So American corporations, overshadowed by American government, can make choices about how much they censor, how much they moderate, really, how much they moderate the content. And so very often the British media are complaining about things that happen, but their politicians are powerless to do anything about it online. So yeah, they've taken over those areas. But they're also, apart from the big 5 or 6 companies, sort of Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Alphabet, which is effectively Google. And I suppose Nvidia is now one of those, the big 6, the chip maker. But apart from those big companies, there are lots of smaller US tech companies. If you want to order something go to an event, you'll maybe order it through Eventbrite. If you want to do online dating, you might use, say, Bumble, which is a US owned, and a huge number of these are operated in California. And as you say, they provide great services, but they also pay very little tax. They have monopoly power, so they can charge more than you would expect to pay, for example, as an owner of a property, letting it out through Airbnb. But they've also got into a position where it's not just that they've outcompeted British alternatives, but the government have not supported British alternatives. And one of the obvious ways that that's happened is the tax system. So if you build up something in the UK, you're incentivized from a tax point of view to sell out. So what American companies can do is they can wait and see what works locally, and then they can buy up that company. And with entrepreneurs' relief and other reliefs, entrepreneurs can very often sell. It's much more profitable for them to sell out than it is to carry on trading.
On this tech front, there's also the move towards software as a service as opposed to buying it. Has that pushed things towards America as well?
The Americans have been brilliant at harnessing software as a service. I mean, so what this basically means is you used to buy your software and get free updates. Actually, what happens now is you never buy the software at all. You pay a fee, a monthly fee, and monthly has become the thing. People are paid at the end of each month, so the companies have geared themselves to charge soon after that. So they're sort of harvesting people's pay. And the software as a service means that companies are on a sort of treadmill where they have to buy the software and pay every month. And I mean, Salesforce is one of the great winners from that. And they can their charges are often opaque, and they can nudge them up month by month. And of course, they can increase the services they sell. And it's not that they're not useful services. It's that what the American corporations have realized is that a reliable sort of annuity stream of income, a monthly payment, is much better than selling. So that in an economic downturn, they're still collecting their money, their income and their profits, but also in particular, it's good for them for borrowing. Banks are much happier to lend to a software company against a reliable flow of income rather than against projected sales. And we see it with online streaming. So Apple, with the storage that they sell, but also the Apple TV and Netflix and Disney, all of them are effectively doing sort of something like software as a service. I've called it, in the book, I've called it life as a service, because so many of the things we buy, they've geared them so that they charge you every month, whether you use them or not. I mean, classic cases being something like the gym, where you probably one signs up for it and then doesn't use it, but there's money still going out every month. And in the case of gyms, very often to US corporations. So yeah, they've harnessed the monthly subscription model. And it's not just about payments. It's that Americans have been brilliant at, or American corporations have been brilliant at using psychology. It's brilliant, and it's a kind of dark brilliance as well, because we sign up for things sometimes unaware what we're doing, and sometimes we kind of choose the obvious option on the screen, but it turns out to be not the right one for us. A good example is storage. They can nudge you into paying for the amount of storage that works for them, but it may not be the right for an individual. So if you've got a small amount of storage, a medium amount, and a large amount, most of us will go for the middle. Because in fact, if we do the numbers, it's probably fine for us to have the smaller amount and to upgrade later on if we need to. But it put the whole of the economy onto this sort of treadmill of monthly payments, and it's put the whole of the British economy into a situation where it really can't get out of that. It's locked in. And of course, the corporations have been trying to do that across the world, but they've been particularly successful in the UK because our policymakers have been so welcoming.
The idea of Americans putting money into the UK seems great. I mean, if they run a company well, it will boost our economy, more money will end up in our government tax coffers. I mean, what's the catch?
Well, there are two problems with that sort of Panglossian optimistic approach. The first is they tend to put money in when if they're talking about private equity, they're putting money in when they're buying a bargain, and they are experts at buying bargain. And in a sense, it's not that they're outbidding, it's they're finding things better. They're sometimes outbidding. But I mean, in the case of Morrison's that was sold, there was a UK company, Lancashire, there was a bidding war between two US private equity companies. So whoever won it, it was going to go to the US. So they're not putting in quite as much as you would think when they're buying things, and they're often doing a lot of borrowing, gearing, which sometimes makes the project more risky, but also reduces the amount of tax they have to pay. And the other thing about putting money into the economy, if it's something like one of the many platform companies, they're actually not putting much money in at all. They're just extending it to include the country. So they're not so much investing in the country as treating the company as another marketplace. But the second point that you made was about tax. Well, they're paying very little. And the Internal Revenue Service of the US has produced figures showing how much they pay. And basically they pay 7 or 8%, whereas the rest of the UK companies are paying 25% corporation tax now. So it's a really quite a small contribution to the economy for the amount of business that they do and the amount of profits they make. There is a move that's progressing well to a world tax, a global tax system, but that will still mean that they're only paying 15% tax, whereas the local companies are paying 25% tax. And it may not sound much to people, oh, it's a chunk of tax, it's a small chunk or a slightly bigger chunk, but actually over a number of years makes a huge difference to how profitable a company is and how much it can reinvest as well. Companies are reinvesting money out of their after-tax income. So no, unfortunately, the idea of it being a benign influence and it contributing to our economy is a bit, I think, misguided and optimistic. And I think many politicians in Westminster have kind of swallowed the story and are wrong. And I'm hoping that they'll look at the numbers more. And I think they will. I think it'll become more apparent as particularly private equity make more and more high-profile takeovers. One of the problems with that is, of course, that the British press often reports something as being taken over, and they might name the company, but they don't focus on the main country that does the takeovers.
Right.
And I think they should.
It feels a bit like tax is one of the keys to this problem. Can you talk to a bit about tax havens and loopholes and how they contribute?
Yes. Well, all the multinationals are trying to minimise their tax. And one of the things they can do is they can legitimately, as in legally, it's within the law but not within the spirit of the law, they can put trademarks in offshore tax havens. And if, for example, I mean, this is a hypothetical example, I think, but if someone like Starbucks owns their trademarks in the Cayman Islands, they can make an annual payment from the British subsidiary for the use of those trademarks. So the money will go out of the British subsidiary into a place where either very low tax or no tax is paid in the tax haven, and then the British subsidiary will therefore show lower profits and will pay much less tax. So, and all the companies are doing a similar thing. It's called transfer pricing, where they're effectively transferring a royalty payment to an offshore haven. And that's been going on for a long time, but it's been going on at greater scale in the last few years. And it's quite hard to stop. The revenue have to show that those amounts of payment for royalties are inappropriate. And so this is one of the things the global tax deal is trying to address. But it's particularly invidious for the British, because of the main 10 tax havens, the British control 8 of them. So the British can't really say we don't approve of tax havens, because the British have such a big stake in tax havens, whether it's Guernsey or Jersey or the British Virgin Islands. What British would have to do is to unwind the whole tax haven structure, and of course they get a lot of local opposition for that from each of those territories. But they probably should do that if they want to collect more tax for Westminster. The Americans by contrast, the Americans are very good at collecting their tax. So they say to these companies, well, you may have avoided tax in Britain by doing things through the Cayman Islands or British Virgin Islands, but when it comes on shore to the US, you'll pay tax at that point. They're also very much better, as anyone who's ever been an American citizen, like Boris Johnson was, they're very much better at collecting from people's worldwide income, and even when they're working abroad. So Boris Johnson suddenly found, when he sold a house in Islington, that he was liable to pay tax on the gain to the Americans. He quickly stopped being an American citizen after that. But it's a feature of the American government that then, and the Americans in general, that they're not just efficient in business, but they're efficient at collecting tax. So I think there are many cases where what you might think of as what should be British tax ends up in Washington.
Why is that they're so much better? Is it a power thing?
It's partly power. It's partly that the politicians support the companies and threaten the British with sanctions if they don't comply. And that sounds dramatic, but actually it's exactly what happened with the efforts by the British to introduce a digital tax. That is a tax that would affect the tech companies. And the Americans said, if you do that, we won't give you a trade deal. So it's partly a power thing, yes. But it's also partly a culture thing, that the Americans are more efficient at collecting it. And they, of course, they collect tax in two different ways. They collect it nationally at federal level and at state level. And so they have, in a sense, they have two sets of eyes on their operations.
Why has this happened so much to us? I'm assuming it's not happening in the same way to France or Spain, Germany.
Well, one way to gauge how much the Americans have penetrated the economy is to look at how many people work for American corporations. And in the book I've shown that about 2 million people in the UK, that is out of 30 million people working, about 2 million work for American corporations. By comparison, the number in Germany is less than a quarter of that, 450,000, and a sixth of that, a bit over 300,000 in France, and even less in Italy and Spain. So taking those other four big European countries, it's mostly because those countries have said enough is enough. They've said they're going to protect their jobs and their companies, going to protect them from takeover. So the French famously introduced the Danone law, which was to protect their yogurt company, milk and yogurt company, Danone, and they said this is a strategic asset. And that's not the sort of thing the British would have done. But in a way they were right, it is a strategic asset. Local communities depend on having milk collection every day from the farmers. Many of their companies, many of their manufacturing plants are in parts of France where there's high unemployment. So it is a strategic asset in that sense. So the French have refused. The Germans too have said, no, we've got a large number of family-owned companies, the Mittelstand, which are not going to be subject to US takeover. And that's partly German laws, but it's also partly German culture. I think if you own a medium-sized German company, you would lose your social standing if you said, oh, we're selling out to a bunch of Americans. Whereas the culture is different in the UK. We've been very much inclined to welcome them. So it's regulation, it's tax, it's culture, but the European countries have been particularly resistant. But ever since Margaret Thatcher's time, the British have said we're open for business. And by open for business, essentially we mean we're for sale. And in many cases it's felt like a jumble sale. The last few months, well, the last year, there have been a lot of British companies taken over, to some extent on the cheap. I mean, the recent one was a cybersecurity company called Darktrace in Cambridge, but there are dozens of them. And particularly, even companies that are critical to the British state, defence companies have been taken over. So we sold Ultra and other defence contractors in the last 2 or 3 years to big US defence contractors.
Why are British investors so happy to just sell up like that?
Yes, British investors are a big part of it. There's a need to report results every quarter, and it gives, as Paul Miners of the City, who died recently, Paul Miners said, it gives a pop to your results as an investment manager if you get a premium in a takeover in any given quarter. It's partly that. It's largely that we haven't set up a structure where people take a long view. I mean, we could do things about it. For example, the institutional investors, when they this is pension funds and insurance companies, when they sell shares, they don't pay any tax on them. It'd be quite reasonable and easy for the government to introduce a rule saying when you sell shares, they're tax-free if you've owned them for at least 5 years. Otherwise, you pay normal capital gains tax, which would discourage sales. And there are lots of things that the government could do to discourage this sort of short-termism. But it's partly about investors, and it's partly about the structure of the tax system. But there are some markets where you really have to accept that if you want to keep a local firm, its economics aren't going to be so good. Right. Markets where a huge American corporation has economies of scale that you wouldn't have for a UK company. But you'd still have some economies of scale, and we're big enough that we should be able to, for example, produce our own cereal. Well, in fact, we've mostly depended on Kellogg's and General Mills for cereal, and they've taken over more and more brands, and private equity, I think, took over Dorset cereals in recent years. And so in the supermarket, the branded products are mostly American. Mars Corporation sells Uncle Ben's rice. The leading dog and cat foods are from US corporations. So we've allowed it to happen, and we should care. I mean, we should have a buy British policy and a support British companies policy. We absolutely don't have that. The Americans do, and the Europeans, whom you've mentioned, they have a buy local policy, and quite strong policies as well, where the government, particularly, for example, government procurement, where a government department is buying stuff. If they're buying it in Germany, they'll buy from a German company. And the same in the States. In fact, in the States, unless the price difference is very large, they mostly have to buy local. So we need to recognise the issue and have I wouldn't say nationalistic, but local buying policy. But it requires action from government.
Our politicians love to talk about the special relationship. Do you think American politicians see it in the same way?
Well, I think mostly the American politicians don't think about us at all. And that's the kind of humbling thing. I've just come back from a trip to America, which I loved. And there was very little talk about what's happening in Britain. We're a relatively small country. They're mostly preoccupied by domestic affairs. So I don't think the special relationship is as prominent in Americans' minds, whether it's individuals or their politicians. One retired American diplomat said when he was interviewed after he'd retired, he said, when the British were around, we were given instructions to refer very often to the special relationship in hushed terms and with reverence. But once the British had gone, we laughed about it behind their backs. And I think that is a much more accurate reflection of the special relationship. I mean, there is a close relationship, political and military relationship, but it's not an equal relationship or anything like it. It's a relationship of more of master and servant. And in a way, that's why I've called the book Vassal State, because vassalage comprises two parts. One is working for the economic benefit of your master, and the other is doing what you're told by the master. So when it comes to the first of those, that's what our companies do. They work, or what the economy does, it works for the advantage of the Americans. But in terms of what our politicians do, they largely do what they're told by the Americans, I'm afraid.
You've got some chapters on government spending. Obviously, the biggest one is healthcare. Has the NHS been immune to this American influence?
The Americans have done very well out of the NHS, and there's an extraordinary suggestion that people say the want to take over the NHS. Well, they don't want to take over the NHS because the NHS is a centre of spending. You don't want to take over something where you're spending money and committed to looking to a sort of a blank check in terms of how much you spend in looking after an ageing population. What the Americans want to do sensibly, like most other countries, is supply profitably where they can. And in that sense, the Americans have taken over the NHS to a much greater extent than is realised. So if you get a new hip joint or knee joint, the NHS are going to be buying it from Stryker, a US company, most probably. Many of the leading drugs are from US companies. But it's not just that, it's also all the kind of things that we never speak of, the incontinence treatments, incontinence equipment is often supplied by Johnson & Johnson, things that are equipment for dentists and glasses and contact lenses particularly are dominated by US suppliers. And so it's all that equipment that is predominantly supplied by US corporations and consultants. Often when the NHS is having a reorganisation, which it seems to be having almost all the time, they'll bring out outside consultants, and the predominant management consultants in the world are all three of them are based in Boston. So the sort of big three from Boston, McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group and so on. So they've become huge suppliers to the NHS, and it's profitable business for them. And I mean, one example of that is COVID. I mean, we ended up with buying, even though the first jab against COVID was developed in this country, and we've got our own companies like GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca in this case. Even despite that, over half the flu jabs were bought from America, and mostly from Pfizer, and that was profitable business.
So even the Oxford one going to be profit-free, but we went with the American ones anyway.
Exactly. So we acted, I think, irrationally on that. But the other problem about that is that the British were so poor at negotiating. So during the COVID period, Pfizer, although it was clearly a very profitable business without a price increase, they were able to put up the price. So, and that's probably typical of maybe corporate behaviour, certainly American corporations' behaviour, that they take advantage of the market position. And you may say every business should, but it doesn't kind of feel right sometimes. And you give them the contrast of a local, not-for-profit offering.
Is it that the Americans put so much into R&D that they're quite far ahead, so it makes sense to go with them?
The Americans are good on R&D, and they've got the advantage that with a big home market, once they've developed something for the home market, if they're able to sell it abroad, in a sense, all those fixed costs of R&D and setting up factories, they're all covered, so that it's the extra sales abroad are very profitable. I mean, if you think of someone like Apple, they would be a very profitable company, and they do a lot of R&D. Apple Corporation would be very profitable just supplying to the US. So supplies to the UK, sales to the UK are particularly profitable. Having said which, they take advantage of their market strength, and what costs a phone that costs $1,000 in the States costs £1,000 here, so almost 30% more. But they're responding to what they think they can get away with in the market. But yeah, they do a lot of R&D, but the British have been brilliant at R&D as well. But we've allowed some of our companies who do their very best R&D, we've allowed them to be taken over. So Arm Corporation, the chip company based in Cambridge, still based there, or at least it has some important operations there, that was taken over by a Japanese fund, and then ultimately now it's listed in New York and probably will become a US company.
What about other areas of government spending, such as defence?
Well, defence is an interesting one because you're so locked in. You can't just say, oh, we'll buy this. The systems work together. Right. And the Americans have very much taken advantage of that. And so companies like Boeing, because we come across them with the civil aviation and tourist flying, because we come across them that way, we think of them as supplying planes for civilians. But of course, their big market really is the military market. And if the British want to, if the Air Force want a plane, they'll often be buying it from US suppliers. But they're interlocked. So if you have a refueling plane, it will usually work best, or maybe only work, with other US planes. So you tend to, but also the Department of Defence specifies in many cases what equipment the British should buy, and so the whole argument that the Americans have been making for some years now, since Obama really, and including Trump and including Biden, the whole argument that the British should spend more on defence is also very self-serving, because that extra spending will be on equipment from US corporations. So it's not as altruistic as it sounds, and to some extent that goes also for their encouragement to the French and Germans to spend more on defence. Some of that, probably quite a lot of it, will be spent with US companies.
If we look at the government money, which is taxpayer money, the amount of it that ends up in American coffers, do you think that is in British interests?
No, absolutely not. No, we should be buying from our local suppliers when we can, and if there's a profit, which hopefully there will be if it's a commercial business, if there's a profit made on the transaction, the tax should be going locally. You know, it's we're really becoming a sort of small subsidiary of the US, but it has big consequences. I mean, it's not just about tax; it's also about jobs. The sorts of jobs that we have in the UK are much more likely now to be more menial jobs, sort of delivery jobs. I'm not saying it's menial. I mean, it's an important job, especially when you get your parcel delivered. But it's that the more senior management jobs and R&D jobs, and those that require more qualifications, tend to go to the US. So it's about jobs. It's also about the best talent. So many very able scientists and researchers go to the US. So the US is able to kind of poach who it wants, and you can't blame the individuals for going there. They'll often get paid more and have a good lifestyle, but it impoverishes the UK. But I mean, talking of impoverishment, we know that the UK GDP per household, which is a good measure of wealth, is about the same as the GDP per household in Mississippi, which is the poorest of the US states. So this whole takeover by the Americans has contributed to, it's not the sole cause of it, but it's contributed towards the impoverishment of the UK. And the process is continuing. It won't surprise me at all if the figures in 2 or 3 years show that Mississippi is better off than the average. The Mississippi person on average, is better off than the typical British person. So it has consequences, and it also has consequences around control, that we can't make decisions about our own lives, and we have to refer back constantly to the Americans. I mean, in military terms, there's been a discussion about what happens with Ukraine, and it's clear that the puppet master is in Washington. The British talk a lot about offering support, and they have been good at doing that, but the ultimate decisions are made in Washington, and any European discussion it's completely overshadowed by what's decided in Washington.
If we carry on as we are, where will we end up, do you think?
I think we'll end up resenting it and realising what's happened, but too late, even more too late than now. I think the impoverishment will continue. I think the takeovers will continue. I think the erosion of the tax base will continue. So it's becoming clear with the new Labour government, it's becoming clear that they're poorer than they thought they were, and we are generally much poorer than we thought we were, and that process is continuing. And the result is you have to cut back. One of the things that Rachel Reeves did in the first couple of weeks was cancel a whole lot of projects. And they're realising they've had to cancel recently paying a winter fuel payment to pensioners. I mean, that there are lots of issues around that, and maybe that was a fair thing to do from an intergenerational fairness point of view. But they didn't do it from the point of view of intergenerational fairness. They did it because they'd run out of money. And that's essentially, to answer your question, what the consequence will be. We'll run out of money, and we'll realise we've run out of money, and we'll have to make very painful cuts. It may well lead to unemployment. The jobs that are available at the moment, many of them are being taken over and phased out by artificial intelligence, and we're unfortunately kind of the victim of that rather than being involved in the debate. We're kind of the British are just at the receiving end.
A lot of the research you've done for this book is quite incredible. How difficult was it for you to get this information?
Well, it's been great fun, partly because so few people worry about these subjects, and I think more people should be looking into this. But my first foray into finding the raw numbers was I just thought, well, I want to know how much the Americans sell in the UK. So I went to the Inland Revenue, or HMRC, and asked them, and they said, we don't know. And I said, but you must know, because the OECD, the Organisation of European Economies, is collecting this money from the corporations. And they then said, well, we do know. We're sorry we made that mistake, but actually we're not telling you. And so I thought, blimey, taxpayers paying for this information. It's global. It's not particularly sensitive it's not particularly related to individual firms. Why aren't you telling me? And then one of the people at HMRC gave me a sort of quiet tip-off, and they said, actually, although we can't tell you, you might find the Americans will. Right. And they gave me a link to a very obscure web page, and it turned out the Americans have got the same data, but they made it public. So I was able to look at that page and or those pages and find out lots more about the statistics. But the other thing that I was able to do was I did quite a lot of searches in the media, but also at Companies House and also the Land Registry. So I found out, for example, that Google's new headquarters, which you would just assume that they own and is a registered British property, turns out that's owned through a Luxembourg company. So that's obviously for tax reasons. And so quite a lot of research. I was going to real primary sources like the Land Registry. And where I was going to Companies House, I was able to find, for example, the extent to which Costco, so the big cash and carry companies, expanded hugely. It's a very successful company in the US, and it's expanding so fast. I think it's expanding at 50% in 3 years. It's a great rate of expansion. It means, within a couple of decades, they'll be very dominant. And they're an important player now. But I was able to go to Companies House for Costco and look up how much tax they paid, and they were an exception. And they were a very good exception. They pay their full tax. There's no effort at all to dodge their tax, and it's paid over the full 25% of profits. And so the picture is, once you get into the sort of what they call granularity of it, you see that the generalizations are right, but there are exceptions. So there are some good American companies out there that have chosen, although there were ways they could reduce their tax, they've chosen to pay the full whack. But they're unfortunately too few and far between, as they are with British companies, has to be said. So the answer to the research question is, I used lots of sources, many of them primary sources, but I also interviewed people. So I spoke to business people. I spoke to Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was very good. He's a very business-like guy. He was one of the best chancellors we've had in recent years. He was the one who tried to introduce digital services tax, and so I got support from people like that who were willing to talk and willing to say on the record things that reveal how exposed the British are. I mean, he told me how keen desperate almost the British have been to get a trade deal with the Americans, and the Americans held it over this possibility. They've held it over the British with a view to getting other concessions. So Philip was good, and individual business people told me, often they told me that they wanted to, they'd tell me stuff, but only on condition that I didn't reveal who they were, because these are often people trading with American companies, and they worried that it would jeopardize their relationship or even end it. But they often told me how American companies locked them in to particular suppliers.
Taking a step back and looking at it all in the round, I mean, why is this happening? Is it the American spirit? Are they better than us at business? Is it the end of our empire and the rise of theirs?
Interesting. Definitely it's the rise of theirs. The American economic empire is hugely dominant, and they've. I put a quote in there that from a researcher almost 100 years ago, where he said, "We, the Americans, are too wise to build a political empire where we actually control countries. We're going to influence them politically, and we're going to own the businesses in those countries." So it's an economic empire as well as, and to a lesser extent, but it's also a political empire. So I think the Americans' empire has risen as the British one has been really shrinking. But I think there is a really profound question that you're asking, is whether the Americans are better at business. I think it's probably true that the American society is more materialistic, that American upbringing of the way people are brought up in the States does give more focus on making a profit and being having an economically successful life. And I think they've been particularly successful with internet, with online businesses. And that's probably because so much of it started there, but also it fits in very well with American culture, the idea of kind of, if you're setting up a business, to do it at a big scale. And I think they've been particularly successful at borrowing, at sensibly borrowing. So the gearing that the private equity has done is something that other countries haven't, British companies haven't done so well. But there is a fundamental question. They're more interested in business as a whole, and they are probably more successful at it. But there are many British companies who are successful, and we shouldn't allow their focus on business to stop us having our own successful businesses. I mean, the Germans haven't allowed that to stop them, nor the French. So I think it's that we've rolled over and we've accepted things that we shouldn't accept. And it's actually been a kind of mutually reinforcing process. As the British have welcomed the Americans in, they've kind of welcomed their friends in, a bit like someone saying there's a party on tonight, let's go, and everyone's kind of joined in. So there are 1,200 multinationals, 1,200 multinationals operating in the UK, significantly more than in any other European country or in any other country around the world. They've just all realised that there's a party on, let's join. We're welcomed in. We can make as much money as we like. We can take over local companies. We can pay low tax, and of course, Britain is a useful country to act as a bridgehead if you want to do operations in Europe. So we've been very useful to them as a place as a kind of start to a European expansion. So very often, companies who have a European and Middle East operation base it in the UK. So in that sense, there are some benefits to us in having those headquarters here. Of course, the big sort of factor as well is Ireland, because Ireland is itself a tax haven, but of a different sort, and a lot of American corporations are based there that sell into the UK. So, I mean, Ancestry.com, for example, selling genealogy kits and information that's based in Ireland, but a lot of the tech companies as well. Google have a big office there, and a lot of the pharma companies as well, and of course Apple, obviously. They're based in, so that accentuates the point you were making about empire. Their economic empire takes advantage of territories next to other territories, so they're able to use Ireland to get into the UK, so Ireland's economy is deeply affected by it. I mean, the bulk of their economy is American companies coming in and selling from there, not just to the UK but also to Europe. And in fact, their tax base is 20% of it is from corporation tax receipts from even though they've got a low tax rate, there's so much going through there that 20% of their budget is paid for by US taxes. Probably a bit more after yesterday's ruling, day before yesterday's ruling, that Apple would have to pay £13 billion pounds, I think it is, yes, of back taxes.
What can we do to fix this, or more importantly, can we fix this?
I think there are loads of little things and big things that the British government can do and policymakers can do to change things, to make it to make us less of a vassal state. We need to start by saying we want to be independent. We need to organise our tax system, which is broken in so many ways, that people are incentivised to build businesses that stay British. We need to make our tax system so that the American companies that are already here, Kellogg's and many others, I'm only picking that one out because it's high profile, but that those companies pay the full tax that was intended by Parliament. I think they will accurately say they pay the full amount that's legally required, but that's something slightly different. So there are those policies, but we also need to work, I think, much more closely with Europe. I mean, we had this very close and good relationship with Europe that we've rather hugely damaged with Brexit, and there are many companies that would be more economic if they were selling to Europe as well. So I think ultimately you could think of it like this. You could think of there are three big trading blocs in the world. There's America, there's Europe, and there's China. And most countries fall under one of those blocks. So it's very odd with us being an island offshore Europe and 2,000 miles away from America that we should have tried to join the American trading bloc. But the natural one for us to be in and the most sensible one for us to be in is the European one. And even though there is this unusual historic relationship with America, we should keep that as it is, historic and unusual and still profitable for everyone, while being essentially part of Europe. So I think there's a lot we can do. And there's also a lot we can do in terms of measuring. At the moment, I mean, although I got, as I say, lots of primary sources and lots of data, there's a lot that I don't know and wanted to know. And quite often when I would go to government department and say, how much of your supplies come from the US, they would say, we don't know. And the tone of their response is, we don't care. So my view is that we can really help. The first stage of any treatment is diagnosis. And the first stage of dealing with an economic problem is to measure it. And so in a way that comes before everything. Having recognised the issue, we need to start measuring so that we know in each sector how much of it is American companies and how many Chinese companies for that matter. And then we can start to act more rationally. At the moment, the politicians are somewhat, if they're acting at all, they're acting in the dark.
The last thing I wanted to ask you, I thought reading the book, I felt a lot of the information in here is more important than most of the things that dominate the news cycle, but no one's talking about it apart from you. I mean, what can we do about that, and why is that?
The news cycle is so pernicious almost, and there's a randomness about it. I mean, we had a big story about last week about the Oasis ticket sales for a big band and how they were being the system wasn't fair on consumers and how ticket touts were taking advantage. And yes, so certainly some ticket touts were making money on this, but I mean this is just one example from the news cycle. But actually the big story there was that almost all the profits from that whole exercise of selling those tickets was going to a company called Ticketmaster, which is US owned. Can't we sell our own tickets in this country and have a local company that makes the profits? So the news cycle, yes, is overly dominated by things that catch people's imagination and not by the underlying really important economic forces. And quite often when there's a story about a takeover, they say, oh, this company's being taken over, and they concentrate on the details of the victim, the company that's being taken over, and not on who's doing it. And when they mention the name of the company taking over, they don't mention what country it's from. So Hotel Chocolat, a successful UK chocolate producer and retailer, was taken over, and they said, oh, it's being taken over. And some of the news stories mentioned it was being taken over by Mars Corporation, but not everyone would realise that's an American company. So it was yet another US takeover where the highlighted part was how much money Angus Thirlwell, the chief executive, how much he was making and what was going to happen to the stores, whereas the real emphasis ought to have been who was doing it. So yeah, I sometimes I despair of it, but then I think, well, the right thing to do is to keep highlighting it. I mean, one of the biggest news stories in any newspaper or website, general news website, is about football. So constant stories about football and which player is up and which manager is in a new position. But one of the big stories about football is that 52% of the Premier League is owned by Americans. Right. So of the 20 clubs, they own 9, but those tend to be the bigger clubs. So actually, American ownership of our football industry ought to be discussed at least somewhat. But I think partly there's a problem that we parcel things up. People think, oh, that's economics, and we're about football. But it actually matters who owns the football clubs because it affects what they do with them. So, yeah, I get frustrated about the news cycle. But I think the news organisations will catch up, but they're also quite hesitant to, even when they realise it, because they don't want to be seen as anti-American. And I don't think you have to be anti-American. I mean, I'm not anti-American at all. I'm anti-Americans owning us. And so I think we need absolutely make this distinction in our heads. I've just been to America and enjoyed it. I've got American cousins. I've got lots of American friends. I buy American products all the time. I've got American investments. That doesn't need to stop me from saying, hold on, guys, they shouldn't be running this place. And in a way, that's what vassal state is. It's a call for British independence and British economic independence, and to say we don't dislike Americans, but we don't need them to run everything.
Angus Hanton, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.